Before I start, I just want to start with a very brief acknowledgement. Events in Myanmar has been extremely tragic. Things are shifting very fast. There are lots and lots of territorial control issues that are going on. There's a lot of shifting allegiances. There's shifting politics that's going on. Sometimes it's hard to kind of always keep up with it from afar. But I do want to acknowledge that a lot of the work that's coming out from on the ground is done by very brave researchers and reporters on the ground who are in Myanmar, who are around the region, also on the China border, in Thailand, and in Northeast India. So just want to acknowledge the work that these people are doing. The photograph that you see here was sent to me by my dear friend Ong Tutu, who is the husband and a wonderful painter of my friend and Burmese teacher, Amasu. This image is actually, most of you might recognize this. This is right after the 2021 coup. And people came out, civilians, people who were working in education, and doctors, engineers, normal people came out with pots and banging pots in order to protest against the military actions that they, especially after the arrests of all of the legitimately elected government officials. And of course, during this time, people were out on the streets. Everybody thought that it was going to be a sort of non-violent civil disobedience movement. It was called the CDM. So people were part of the CDM movement. Everybody came out. And this was a country-wide effort across Myanmar, and not just in Myanmar, but also many people in Northeast India, particularly in the state of Mizoram, came out. There were protest songs. They were singing Gajamache Bu, which in Burmese means until the end of the world, we are going to protest against the military because people have had enough. Now, all of this is, of course, in the background of a military dictatorship and also a complete reholement of the economy and the militaries and their cronies, control of Burmese economy, and also territorialization into the ethnic areas through a very specific kind of Burma Buddhist nationalism, right? And so people came out, but of course the scenes would very quickly change because I think about a month later, already on the 3rd of March, the military, installed martial law on the streets, and you had scenes of fighting. You had people who were just coming up. There were tear gases thrown out, machine guns. Of course, this would youngsters who I know, even my research assistant from Yangon, went out on the street with telephone numbers and blood group, written on their arms, just to showcase that anything come what may, they had seen what was possible with the landslide victory of the NLD led by Aung San Suu Kyi in 2015, November 2015. And so those years were a bit of kind of this so-called transition. It was a very misunderstood transition, but it was still a transition period. A lot of, Myanmar was seen as a frontier economy where international organizations could go in finally after years and years of sanctions. And so this generation, Gen Z, had tasted what this could be like. They had tasted this form of democracy, very hard-fought democracy that people have been fighting since so long. And yet what happened, as we know, most of us, is that the CDM would not necessarily sustain, and then people would have to actually go into the borders. Many of these youngsters had finally then gone into the borders, particularly in areas like Karen State, Kachin State, Chin State, Karenni. These are all ethnic minority areas, which, and this is a very interesting moment because finally, a lot of the people who were in Yangon, Naypyidaw, Magwe, these are like, central cities in Burma, they were very much pro-NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, very pro-democracy. They had not necessarily understood what the politics in the borders really was. Now, the politics in the borders is what you see here, the Kachin Independence Army. These are youngsters who are fighting. Their regular life is imbricated with rebellion that has gone on since, some would argue 1947, some would argue 1962, some would argue intensifying in the 80s and so on. And finally, there was a meeting of these youngsters in the border. you know? And it's really interesting. This showcases a kind of understanding, empathy that they did not possibly have before in terms of what it means to be part of an armed revolution. Now, meanwhile, if you've been looking at the news, the NUG, and then there were PDFs, for example, People's Defense Forces, a range of different allies, and the military themselves, they started aligning with other actors. A lot of the actors that were anti-military before are now pro-military. It's a very shifting, fluid kind of scenario. And we can come to the complexities of that during the discussion. But, one point that I want to make here is that this is not just something that you see in the border. This is not the picture of the border only in 2021 or 2022 or even now. Yes, the war is going on, but the war had been going on in the border areas for forever. And this is, I wanted to show you this. So this is 2016, December. I was at the China-Myanmar border in a place called Wanting. So Wanting is very famous among Chinese tourists. Many of them come from Tanchong, Mangshi, inland areas to go and see the Burma Road, which has a very specific history, the Burma Road during the Second World War. So there is a museum there and so on. But in 2016, people were not coming to see the Burma Road. People organized, they had their WeChat and everything, and everybody was looking at where are the best locations to spot the war. So when I asked people, what are you here for? What are you coming to see? They said, 我们来看打仗. We came here to see the war. And then when you ask them, what else are you trying to see, right? They said, 我要看难民. Nanming means like the refugees. In Chinese, Nanming is like somebody in trouble, literally. Okay, now this is the picture that you would have seen not in 2021, but already in 2016, which is only a few months after the NLD came into power. And you also had a wide recognition in the borderland areas that the NCA was not going to work, the National Ceasefire Agreement was not going to work. So this particular war was staged by something called the Northern Alliance. And the Northern Alliance was then a group of 4 ethnic armed organizations, EAO, as they are known in Myanmar, not rebels, not insurgents, but EAOs. These are non-ceasefire groups. There are other ceasefire groups as well, and there are militias who are called Pitusek in Burmese. So this was staged by the TNLA, the Taang National Liberation Army, the Arakan Army, who went all the way from the India-Myanmar border in Rakhine State to Kachin and Shan State, and then also the MNDAA, which is the Kokang Army, and did I miss one? I may have missed one of the parties. And I had the opportunity to actually interview many of the people who were combatants in the Northern Alliance. And I asked them, what is it? Why are you staging this war in the border? And they would say that we need to show them what they don't see. We need to show, because they come into our villages, they come into areas, the war has been so protracted, the ceasefire is not working, the military was still very much in the mode of territorialization, particularly because these areas are also highly resource rich areas, and I'll come to that. And the other thing, if you see from the borderland and not really from a kind of macro geopolitical perspective, you'll also see that there's a perspective of performance in the border. So the Northern Alliance would often tell the people at the border, especially the villagers, this is when we are going to attack. So this is when you need to run away to the China border. And so this little girl, she would tell me exactly what time she needs to go into the China border, come back. And this was almost a kind of spectacle, anti-spectacle kind of scenario that was happening all the time. So people had become completely used to living like that. This is, of course, comical, but of course, the picture here is not comical at all, because China does not have a refugee convention. China has not been signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention, nor the 68 protocol, same with India as well. And so most of these people, so these were photographs sent to me by people who were actually crossing there, and a very good Kachin photographer. this was kind of the regular everyday life of laborers. They would often come into the military, they would hide in the jungle, then they would go into the Myanmar border, then they would come back to the Kachin border. This was basically everyday life. And we can come and discuss that more during the thing. I think it warrants a little bit of a map here, because I've been talking so much about these spaces, but not telling you what is where. So somebody here asked me why I'm not talking about the Bangladesh border. Is because I've not actually done research on the Bangladesh border, but it's a very important border in terms of the humanitarian crisis with the Rohingyas. And where I work, I'm trying to find the... Anyway, so I'm from Assam, which is the unmarked state there. It's northeast of India. It originally used to be the Seven Sisters. Now it's the Eight Sisters with the annexation of Sikkim. And I call it annexation, but this can be politically disputed, of course. And so the India-Myanmar border is about 1,648 kilometers, and it's shared by 4 different states. So you have Arunachal Pradesh. In Chinese, it's called Nanshichang, or south of Tibet. Then you have Nagaland, which has the shortest border with Myanmar. Then you have Manipur, where the politics is very, very different. And Mizoram. Mizoram has been one of the most welcoming states in India, and we can go into the details of that. And on the China side, of course, you have Kachin State and Shan State, which border the Yunnan province in China. And within the Shan State, somewhere in the middle there, you also have the autonomous Wa area, where you have the United Wa State Army. One thing I will say here is that most of these borders are now in the news, you will see, is being more and more secured. I mean, the contestation between the military and the EAOs, ethnic armed organizations, had always been about also who controls what, particularly in terms of also who controls what territory, in terms of what resources these territories have, as well as what kind of gains they can make, both economically and geopolitically. So this is kind of the larger map of this. But what's really important to understand about this is that oftentimes we see that these areas as India, as Myanmar, as China. But me coming from Northeast India, I don't really quite see these regions necessarily as separate countries. Of course, all of these borders were colonial demarcations, and the reverberations of these, political reverberations of these demarcations continue till this day, particularly in matters of citizenship crisis, or, for example, saying who belongs and who doesn't belong. So the classic border stuff there. But so historically speaking, however, I mean, this area has been understood as Zomia. This is many of you are academics here. Many people online will also know this, is that this was Zo comes from the word Zo, Zomi, Zoro, people, in the India-Myanmar border, and Mia means people, really. Zomia is this idea that we can't really look at these as 3 or 4 different regions, as South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, but rather we look at them as highlands. James Scott, who had a very famous or infamous theory about this, saying that most of the last state-escaping people out of centralizing state systems went up to the highlands, and this was based on Edmund Leach's anthropologist idea that most of the people in these highlands, their first priority was to be fiercely independent, which still is very much the case today. And similarly, when you put these borders on top of them, then it obscures a lot of what we really need to know in terms of interconnections. I'll talk a bit about, what those hard borders really look like on the ground. I told you about Arunachal Pradesh. So there is a place called Pangsao Pass in Arunachal Pradesh. There you have oftentimes the Indian paramilitary force, Assam Rifles, which guards these areas. You often see these farcical, comical things, right? It's time to face the reality, militants. It is our job to take you to God. Militants' life is short, and so on. So there is, again, this kind of security performance that goes on in the border. But at the same time, right now, the talk, especially with the kind of regime that we have in India today, which is, again, as opposed to Myanmar's kind of Burma nationalist Buddhist polity, in India, we have a Hindu nationalist polity, which is also creating its own inlays in Northeast India. And with that, we have this FMR regime that used to be there. So free movement of people regime. The point here is that a lot of people, because of the ways in which these borders separated ethnic groups, they use these borders as safe spaces to travel across India, China, and Myanmar for education, for safekeeping, for health. But in 2018, the government actually started a free people's regime, which, oftentimes free and regime doesn't really quite go together, because a regime is often a border, right? And now they have even stopped that. So that's the way in which the India-Myanmar border has been regulated in response to what is happening in Myanmar today. And we can talk more during the discussion. Another way to think about these borders is also the geopolitical and geoeconomic gaze from both India and China. These are highly geostrategic spaces. You have access to the Bay of Bengal. You have major Chinese projects like the Miso project, dam project, which has been halted because of Kachin civil society opposition to it. Then you have several other, SEZs. You have all these things. All of these borders are now spaces for connectivity, for infrastructure projects. So there is a clash of what's going on. There's, on the one hand, there is a state securitization aspect. On the other hand, there is an opening up zeitgeist, and they often clash. And these have very different kind of implications for people who actually live there, because a lot of refugees who used to use these places as safe spaces now are increasingly being legibilized by state infrastructures. And finally, the last two slides, it is really also important to understand that Myanmar's borders are also resource frontiers. You've had this always historically as well. You've had, jade has always been going on, amber, gold, you had teak, lead. In fact, the big theory about this is that, in fact, the colonial borders were also based on extractive frontiers. You had the Burma Oil Company, for example, which is today Castrol and the Oil India Limited. But after the coup, one interesting point about the borders is that while the big ticket kind of natural resource actors have kind of gone out of the country. For example, Thailand was buying a lot of the natural gas from Myanmar, and now it's no longer doing that. That's mostly happening in places which already had military and as well as military allied links. But in the borderlands, extractive economies have actually increased since the coup. And that is connected to the ways in which we see the story of rare earths today. And a lot of good journalists are doing work on this. Final point, most of these borders, particularly in India and China, are also hugely refugee areas now. It's not as well understood as in Thailand or, for example, in Bangladesh, where you do have a lot of this humanitarian infrastructure in place. But because of India and China, the accessibility issues, and also because the junta very categorically blocks humanitarian organizations to go into these places, we have a major refugee situation in the border that's ongoing. And final point here is that most of this is not being handled by international humanitarian organization, but through diaspora money, as well as through very localized form of humanitarian assistance. And I will stop with my input here now, and then we can carry on with the discussion.
I, of course, do have questions. I already want to encourage the people at home that if you have questions, you can submit them via the Q&A button, usually at the bottom of your screen. I can then see them on here and read them out. In here, there will be a microphone that I think Emily is handing around. Not yet, Emily. I do have some questions, and yeah, we'll get to that later. So you said that you've written on both the China-Myanmar and the India-Myanmar border. Mm-hmm. I've already seen it on one of the slides. There were some bananas. We've talked a lot about the war and about the refugee crisis. I do think the banana crisis, I'm calling it here, mm-hmm. Is also interesting to look at, and a good example of showing what's happening in these regions. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit what those bananas have to do with the China border?
Yeah, so thank you for asking that question. It's It's a paper that I wrote with two of my very good colleagues, Alessandro Ripo's an anthropologist, Karen Dean, who works on the Kachin border. So the story in short is that there's, as you know, Myanmar is today, according to the United Nations Crime and Drugs Organization, the largest producer of illegal opium in the world, and also one of the largest exporters. And this has always been the case. So when you look at the China-Myanmar border, for example, or the Shan-Myanmar border, some of the reasons why the ethnic armed organizations are even fighting there, for example, the TNLA, their biggest fight is actually against opium plantation, because they feel that most of the young people there have been completely, I mean, in terms of labor relations and all of this, the lives have been completely ravaged because of the drugs economy. There are lots and lots of Kachin civil society organizations or assistance like the Pajasan movement that works against this, for drug rehabilitation in indigenous ways. Now, that's one picture. The other layer on this is that China, sometime in the 1990s, as part of the going out strategy, decided to have something called the Khitai Fatan, which is the opium replacement, opium substitution policy. And this gave a lot of Yunnanese businessmen the opportunity to actually go into Myanmar and start using the opium replacement funds. Although Kachin state had already banned opium plantation, especially in the KIO-controlled areas, they had banned opium plantations. They were able to use this kind of framework of opium replacement and use, this is also interesting, pesticides who, for example, paraquat, or niacinamides, these are highly dangerous pesticides whose use in China is domestically regulated and in fact banned, but their production is not. And in fact, a lot of their production happens in China's Yunnan province and also inland, but then there needs to be a place for all of these to be dumped. Oftentimes, this used to be the Lao border where you had massive monocultures, banana plantations, groundnuts, but slowly this started coming into Myanmar. And in this picture, this is a picture by a great Kachin photojournalist, Kun Lee. One of the interesting things you see in this photo is that it says, made in product of Philippines. And some of these bananas would be called product of Laos or, product of Ecuador. Some of the stickers would say made in Ecuador bananas, but these bananas were actually made in the China-Myanmar border. Another interesting and important point here is that the people who are working in these banana plantations are oftentimes people who have already been displaced from inland areas in Myanmar because of the virgin and fallow land use law that was used very categorically by the military along with their allies, and particularly in this area by a group called NDAK, which is a militia group. And now they have lost control of these areas since very, very recently. And the leader is missing, probably in China. So they were using refugee labor to become part of this big monoculture industry, getting local farmers to buy into the framework of opium substitution and slowly converting all of these territories in the name of opium plantation into big, large-scale monoculture plantations. And a lot of local people have had very, very difficult living conditions with this because they don't really have a choice to not work in these plantations. And even if they don't work in these plantations, the only other opportunity is then to go inside Myanmar, whose border is actually harder for these people, or to go and work as very, very cheap labor in the China manufacturing hubs in Yunnan, and particularly in cities like Rili and Chiekau. So that's the story of bananas. And it's not the only one of the resources, but it's often overlooked because the larger picture is about road building, about SEZ building, about border trading hubs, or jade and mining, which are also very important. But sometimes the plantation economy is not necessarily as recognized as something that is quite extractive. And if you go to the Myanmar, the border areas, you're not going to see anything else except huge hectares of plantations, which are very, very similar to basically monocultures.
You've mentioned already, China does, of course, as in many other countries, has this infrastructure projects as well, most famously with the Belt and Road Initiative. And you've called it the balancing act approach. So they basically like work with whoever is in power in Myanmar. Can you give us a bit of an overview of what is China's interest, so Beijing's interest in Myanmar? What is their approach, and how did you experience that while on the ground in the region?
I mean, there's a lot of writing about the geopolitics of how Beijing looks at, how China looks at Myanmar. I mean, how China looks at Myanmar, the big picture is that they're trying to work both with whoever is in Naypyidaw, whether that's the military regime, whether it's the NLD. So they have, diplomatically at least, from Beijing, looked at Myanmar as a place where they need Myanmar's strategic location. They also recognize that Myanmar, for example, right now is one of the largest producers of, for example, rare earths. China is the largest exporter as well as the importer of rare earths, and rare earths are also being produced in Kachin State in Myanmar, in places that were, again, controlled by the NDAK. How China sees Myanmar in this case, it's a very long question. And the thing is that it really depends on who is China, which Chinese, because there are so many ways. So the way in which Beijing looks at Myanmar, or even Myanmar's borders, is very different from maybe Han Chinese in Yunnan, and then also how people, the Xiaoshu the minorities like Chimpo as well as Taizu, for example, how they are looking, and they have all these different alliances. They have different businesses. In fact, Chinese, casinos were built across the China-Myanmar border, and now these casinos have been vacated, and mostly Kachin humanitarian organizations and mapping organizations have taken over these borders. So China has always used this border as a kind of out-of-sight zone of capitalism, out-of-sight zone of extractive resources. But at the same time, the groups that are operating here also have their hands tied, because inside is the Burmese military regime, which, as we know, is a massacring, murdering regime. And so for them, the only diplomatic ability to be able to actually access the outside world is through China as well. So then there is a very precarious relationship that ethnic armed organizations have to maintain with China. But at the same time, there is, of course, a sense of parochialism. And oftentimes when I talk to Chinese officials, in Beijing, they often say, talk about the Myanmar border as a very 很脏的地方, like it's a very dirty place, full of opium, scammers, casinos, gangsters, and so on. But if you look at it historically, like you'd see in this photograph, right? If you go to a place called Jiekao, which is the border between China and Myanmar, this is the town where most of the Burmese migrant workers work. The whole wall, the entire wall, is this fictitious mythical account of the harmonious relationship between China and these ethnic minority areas, particularly in the Shan Hills. Now, here in this photograph, you see kind of like Mao Zedong meeting up with one of the Shan chieftains. What we don't see in this photograph, of course, is that this chieftain was one of the last of the Tutsi, the ethnic Tutsi, who were originally the indigenous kind of organization, autochthonous organization, and then this person committed suicide 11 years later. Oh, and by the way, Mao never went there. So there is a sense of this painting a picture of harmony, across the border, need to keep harmony so that we can have our business interests going. Yeah. But at the same time, there is also a parochialism. There is a kind of othering that's going on. There's a kind of almost racialized stuff. Some of you who read Chinese will know what this is saying. But if you don't, I'm just saying that, this was in 2017 or 18 when I took it. This was basically a 通告, like it's a a public warning that's being used to tell poor innocent Chinese citizens not to be beguiled by the very difficult by criminals from Myanmar. And therefore, so that they are not the ones who are taken away to be gambling in the casinos that the Chinese businessmen themselves built, right? So this is a kind of scene that you see in the border that's really, really interesting. It's often lost in the kind of geopolitical analysis of how Beijing looks at it, or how, it's really quite granulated on the ground. And the bottom line, I think, is that for China, Myanmar is really important in terms of resources, in terms of position, and making sure that their boundary is clean, not zang. And for Myanmar's armed organization, they need China in that sense in order to, and therefore you see that diplomatically they're working often also with the military, but they're also working very much with ethnic armed consortiums.
So we do have China on the one side, but then there is this other big power, India, on the other side. Mm-hmm. They also have interests in Myanmar. They also have infrastructure projects.
Yeah.
How are they looking at Myanmar? What are India's interests in the country?
Yeah, so I would say India has a historical amnesia about Myanmar. And what I mean by that is that, I'm from Northeast India. It was easier for me to study Chinese than Burmese because there's nowhere in India that I could have gone to study Burmese. So this is just to give you a sense of, despite the fact that, the British Raj was, in fact, if it wasn't for the colonization of Assam, perhaps northern Myanmar would not be colonized in that way, historically speaking, as well. And of course, you had this entire historical relationship. Aung San Suu Kyi was studying in the same college that I went to in Delhi, and so there's a lot of, and for example, India signifies a lot for activists in Myanmar. This idea of federal democracy, which India at least has a panoply of, in paper. That is something that really appeals to a lot of younger activists and lots of people who are now part of the revolution in Myanmar. So in a way, there is a great demand for India to do something about it, but India has been deeply disappointing and so I've written about this as, they're often lending lip service to democracy, often in diplomatic statements, being very vague, quite, selectively being very blind to things, but at the same time, not really going as far. Right now, there is a very latest news that has come that the ICWA in Delhi they are talking to the NUG, the parallel government. They are talking to NUG's partners. They're talking to civil society actors. But this is very, very new, and we still have to see where that goes. In terms of India's interest in Myanmar, the first one is kind of geopolitical again, because this is linked entirely to the way in which India sees Northeast India. Northeast India has always been a zone of counterinsurgency. So you have the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, very similar kind of politics to Kashmir as well. And so many Northeast Indians feel totally forgotten, and many Northeast Indians also feel racialized in other parts of India. And then there is the question of counterinsurgency in terms of so many groups, starting from the 60s, 70s, 80s, whether it's the Mizo National Front or the United Liberation Front of Assam or the Manipuri groups, Kuki groups. Many groups have actually gone over to Myanmar in collaboration, creating almost a sense of rebel cosmopolitanism in this area. And so India's interest has always been to work through joint counterinsurgency programs, through joint security programs with the military, to secure and work with the military against these armed groups. But recently, again, India has two big infrastructure projects in Myanmar. One is called the Kalagan Multimodal Project. One is called the India Trilateral Highway, and it's part of, sometimes it meets with the Continental Asian Highway that's been going on. So there is a sense of wanting to have connectivity projects, and they also want access to the Bay of Bengal through the Sitwe port. And so you have Adani, who had started talks with a company which was in which Myanmar's military general Min Aung Hlaing has one of the largest shareholdings, the MEHL. It's a consortium of Myanmar industries. That's been going on. It didn't really go anywhere, but Indian private interests becomes entangled with also opening up this Northeast Indian region, which is landlocked, to the Bay of Bengal through ships and VLCCs and so on.
Can you tell us a little bit what those projects mean for the people living there?
Yeah.
The effect of that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have written more about this. And so, for example, the Kaladan multimodal project is this engineering marvel, that's created through dense forests and, through places that are through the south of Mizoram. And from there, the state of the road was something like that a few years ago. You had a lot of people during the 2017 kind of crisis in Rakhine State, and especially with Rohingyas having to go to Bangladesh, many actually came over to the India border. And this is something that's not very documented. And this was the only place where I had actually seen Rakhine Buddhists and Rohingyas actually living and making the border into a safe space. But with the creation of the Kaladan, local people didn't even know what this border was about. You had laborers, a lot of laborers actually died. Environmental impact was not conducted for the road. The DC of Lungklai said, the DC is the district commissioner who sits in the lowest province in Mizoram state, said that, we got away with the environmental impact assessment. And so what this road means to people on the ground is that most people don't even know what this road is about. They haven't been told about border connectivity. They haven't been told about what kind of goodness this could bring in terms of local economy and so on. But there are a lot of places. So Mizoram now has about 50 to 60 to 70,000 maybe. It's difficult to really say how many refugees, but many refugees are now living along the road and in makeshift house and tents. Again, we don't have those UNHCR fancy tents. Like, they're not fancy at all, but not even that, So it's a lot of the people during the road building project, this is going to resume again, have said to me that they had to kind of go away from their safe spaces as refugees as the road was being built. So that's something that, the bringing of roads, the bringing of infrastructure, the bringing of connectivity also intersects with the safe space that borders are for most people who have to escape the Myanmar civil war.
We're almost running out of time. I have more questions now than I had in the beginning.
Maybe we can turn this off and have a more intimate discussion. That would be
so much going on in that region, and I feel like I barely was able to get an overview of all of this. But I do want to ask, what can we maybe take out of this? Like, you're studying the borderlands in your region of the world, but can we maybe also take away from this for European borders and the refugee crisis we have here?
I think the biggest takeaway is that Europe is not having a refugee crisis as much as the global South. And this is a very misunderstood concept, right? Of course, the way in which the Frontex is now one of the largest funded European organizations. You have $100 billion border security industrial complex. Defense industries are gaining from, and this includes, for example, both American and Israeli and tech companies that gain from the border security industrial complex, right? And then in Europe, you also have this regime where on the trains, if you look a certain way, then you can be taken out. And that's something that's an everyday part but more and more people will not even reach to Switzerland. More and more people will be apprehended in the Mediterranean and taken to Libya. And that's the border effect, so that securitization is not an exceptionalism just in kind of in the Asian context or even in the Indian context. But the other thing is that there is a disproportional way in which the global South is taking the burden of so many people being displaced by conflict. So some of the biggest ones are Lebanon, you have Turkey, you have Bangladesh. So I think there needs to be a better understanding of the fact that the border crisis is not necessarily only happening here, that this is being shared, and there's a joint venture between states and neoliberal capitalism, which is creating the border. And what I mean by that is, like, you see what happens now with the war in Myanmar. A lot of the Burmese, nationals or people from Myanmar, they can go to Thailand, where you've had this very long infrastructure of refugees, camps. The camp goes into the city and labor networks and so on. But very few people can go into China and be refugees, so they have to become labor. Very few people can go into India and stay long term without any support. So a lot of people are now crossing borders to become very, very cheap labor, even in places like Singapore. So Singapore, as you know, is made up of the migrant worker economy, right? So you had Southeast Asian, mostly women who are working in the domestic economy. Then you had South Asian men who are working in construction. And over the past few years, when I've gone back to Singapore, there are more and more and more Burmese who are just out on the streets using the public space. And that has actually brought down the labor market, the price, the wage market, entirely en masse for most people, who are Southeast Asian migrant workers. And so border regimes are actually creating cheap labor and further precarity of most of the people who are on the move. And that's something that's also happening here, that's happening in the US-Mexico border as well, that joint venture between, the state and neoliberal capitalism. And that's something I think about a lot too.
Thank you so much for joining us today.